Before I start this, I just want to apologize for taking 2 weeks to make a video. I got hit by a car, and I'm all good. But yeah, I was in the hospital for a little bit, but we're all good. We okay? So let's get to the video. This is my story of dealing with the creeper at a party. In 2012, I was invited to go with my two friends, sisters, to their family's 4th of July party. It was a lot of fun. There was eating, swimming, playing, and then fireworks. So the next year, which is when this took place, I went with them again. For some quick background on the creeper, he's 3 years older than me, and has been arrested for sexual assault on a minor before I met him, and he was still under house arrest, or GPS. It started when I was sitting in the kitchen alone. I was sitting by the snacks, a place where there were 5 chairs. I had my legs stretched out, covering 3 of them. When he came over, we made eye contact, so I said hi, and he said hi back. He touched my legs like a pat, and I thought he meant for me to move my legs so he could sit. At the time, my gut was telling me to get off my lazy butt and go back outside because there were people there, but I was too lazy though and didn't move. I was on my iPod just looking through Tumblr when I heard him say something. The only word that I caught from the whole thing he said was cute. I had to ask him 3 more times to hear it fully, which turned out to be him saying that I was cute. And I didn't know what to do, so I smiled and said thank you. He knew I was 16 because he had asked earlier, and I gave no thought to it. He asked if I had a boyfriend, and I didn't think and said no. He kept saying how cute and good looking I was, and I kept saying thanks. And then finally he got up and left. What I should have done was get up and go outside where there were people. I was just too lazy to get up and move. I also thought that was the end of it. Nope. He came back in a few minutes asking me for my phone number. I got scared because he had his phone out, and I thought he was going to text or call me once I gave him my number. I also thought that if I said no, he would get me in trouble, so I gave it to him. The first text was at 8:09, saying, "Hey there, beautiful," with a winky face. I answered because, again, I thought I would get in trouble if someone found out what was going on. And after a few more texts like that, he said, "You want to go somewhere?" This is when I really freaked out and told one of the sisters what was going on. She freaked out too and told me to stay with her. I did, but that didn't help. He would not take my no, so I had to come up with excuses. He said for me to ditch hanging out with her. What was worse was whenever we were inside, he would rub up against me, motion for me to follow, and make kissy lips at me. In a crowded room, nobody even saw any of this. He even waited by the bathroom line because he saw me in it, so when I was going out, I ran. By the time the fireworks were happening, he caught me alone in a room and forcefully kissed me, as well as touched my butt and my breast. I kept saying I had to go, and when I tried to leave the room, the door wouldn't open. When that was finally open, he started to kiss me again. The only thing that saved me was my friend calling my name, to which I was able to yell to her. After that, he kept trying to get me to go with him. Anytime he got a chance to get close to me, he would say something. He even followed me to the car when I was leaving, which my friend almost started to yell at him. And he continued to text me, saying how at the next party, 3 days after that day, stuff was gonna happen. The next day, he even called me 3 times. Luckily for me, at the next party, people found out, so he wasn't allowed to go. And I haven't heard from him since, most likely because the family made sure my number was out of his phone, to which I am forever grateful. Number 2. Years ago, me, my family, and family friends would go camping at some cabins at Lake Placid, New York. Despite what happened that weekend, that campground holds very fond memories for me that I will cherish forever. This incident happened 4th of July weekend. My family was grilling, and me and my friends, children at the time, were running around and playing cops and robbers. While we played, the campground owner came over to my parents and offered to pay for some food. My parents, being nice, gave him food and beer for free. Eventually, the owner overstayed his welcome and was asked to leave by my friend's dad. And this angered him, and he took off his shirt and tried to fight him. We were not aware that he was an alcoholic and already drunk when he asked for food and beer. They eventually got him to leave, and he came back, this time with a rifle. As me and my friends played, he walked around drunkenly trying to load a rifle. One of my friends, being an innocent kid, walked over to him and asked him what he was doing. and the owner said, "I'm going to show your dad something." One of the adults saw this and rushed over. My friend's dad took the rifle from his hands and threw it across the parking lot, screaming at him that there are kids around. At this point, I knew something bad was happening, and I rushed all of my friends inside of our cabin. At this point, my dad called the police and was recording the whole thing. The police eventually came and arrested him for the night, while the campground owner tried to claim he never had a rifle while saying on video, "Give me my rifle." The police came back the next morning and let us file a temporary restraining order while we stayed the weekend. While this is an incident my family laughs at from time to time, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if he had gotten that rifle loaded. Number 3. This is my mother's story. She doesn't internet much, but said it was okay to share, and I need to take my mind off of the hang-up calls I'm getting. My mom was 13, and this would have been mid to late 1960s. She's the second oldest of 7 children. Her drunk wife-beating dad had just left them all and promptly remarried and started a new family within months. Thus, my grandmother and my older aunt, 15 years old, were both working to make ends meet for such a huge family, and my mom was left to babysit all the younger kids on her own, almost every night of the week. They are in the main bedroom playing games and talking. One bed is pushed up against the wall at almost the same level as a large window. This was a very rural area, and the only thing out of that side of the house was a patch of woods with a cow field on the other side, so they often left the blinds open. Mom is sitting on the bed with her siblings, not really paying attention to the darkness outside. At one point, my Uncle Robbie, 5 years old, goes to the bathroom, and when he is walking back into the room is when he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, pointing over my mother's shoulder at the window. No words, just a long scream before taking a breath and screaming again. Mom looks over and less than the width of a bed from her. A guy's against the glass and grinning like only a true nutjob can. He said it looked like it would hurt to smile that hard. He has one hand against the window, and the other in his pants with a back and forth motion. Yeah, really classy. Mom wasn't having any of it. She told her next oldest sister to get the baby out of the crib, and to get against the door, she slid off the bed, never breaking eye contact with him as she bent down to the floor and pulled the shotgun out from under the bed. The guy didn't seem to understand what he was seeing at first and still stood there, so she fired a slug right into the wall under the window. And the guy lit out of there, tripping over himself. She called Granny at work, and Granny came home. After that event, she'd have an elderly couple from down the street stay with them until they finally moved years later. The next day, they could see it actually puckered the wall outward on the outside of the house. She was close to actually shooting him right through that crappy old house's walls. My mom ended up being a military officer for a reason. She doesn't mess around. The only good thing my grandfather did was make sure his kids over the age of 8 knew how to work a gun against bad men without being afraid of it, and it might have saved all of his first kids' lives. Number 4. I live in a small rural community in the eastern United States. It's a nice little town. Because of my work in the medical field, I've met some interesting folk. I'm also familiar with law enforcement and emergency personnel. Small town life is not as dull and uneventful as people think, especially since everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I have a lot of stories to share, but since this one just happened, I'll start here. Because it's still very recent and the investigation is ongoing, I have to be vague with some details, but I needed to tell someone. I'm single and live alone. Due to a stalker, I've moved twice, but that's another story for another time. However, it is relevant for this story for multiple reasons. The first reason being that I have a dog for the sake of protection, as well as have motion sensors and outdoor security cameras. The second reason being the location of my home, which is literally down the street from the fire department. I can see it from my living room window, and a couple of blocks from the police station. However, next to the fire department is the road department, which is basically a parking lot where they park their road equipment. and empty garbage trucks at night on weekends. Oddly, it doesn't have a security camera. Small town life, I suppose. My house sits on a hill with a good view of that side of the street. Go to the incline, the large trees in the front yard, and the half cornfield on the property next to me. Most people on the street below wouldn't notice me in the backyard unless they were actively looking. However, I can still see the street clearly. This incident happened Saturday evening. The country was holding its annual Independence Day spiel with the community, barbecue, music, fireworks, etc., and I did not attend it because it's just not really my thing. Plus, I have a dog and the sound of fireworks can be traumatizing. Before the big show, I took the dog out to relieve herself in the backyard. There was still at least an hour daylight, but the entire neighborhood was pretty quiet because mostly everybody was at the fairgrounds or various other holiday events. So when an unfamiliar, large, white pickup drove slowly down the street, I noticed. I must have turned around at the end of the street because I saw it again, moving in the opposite direction, only about 20 seconds later. This time it turned into the parking lot of the road department. Now, people have been known to toss things into the empty garbage trucks, usually at night to avoid getting caught because they don't want to or are unable to make the trip to the landfill themselves. Usually it's things like furniture or broken equipment, but I didn't see any of those things in the back of this truck. The driver was somewhat a stocky guy, and he had an average height. He took 3 large black trash bags from the bed of his truck and tossed them one by one into the hopper of the garbage truck, and then he left. No, I swear I'm not one of those meddling rear windows types who always thinks activity is suspicious and that their neighbors are up to no good, but something about this didn't sit right with me. Normally when I see people tossing their garbage into the trucks and leaving, I don't bother reporting it because it's relatively harmless, but this time I had a gut feeling, so I called the police, and if anything, they could get the guy for illegally dumping trash from a barbecue or whatever while I'm on the phone with dispatch. I put my dog inside to cut down on distractions while the officers investigate. A few minutes later, an officer arrived and I crossed the street to meet him, and gave him a description of the events and pointed out which of the trucks the man had tossed the bags. He found the bags and he took photos. He put on gloves and told me to stay back. The bags were tied in a knot at the top and it took him a minute to untie one of them because of the gloves and how tight the knot was, but eventually he got it open. He looked inside for a few seconds, then twisted it closed and took a few steps back.
Shit,
he said under his breath. What? I asked.
it's a body.
I felt sick, and I could tell that he felt sick too. I saw him grow pale, his hand was trembling when he held the radio. Even his voice was shaking as he gave the code to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded confused when she asked him to repeat it. Within 10 minutes, the county sheriff was on the scene. Even he looked sick at the contents of the bag. The coroner arrived about 10 minutes after that, and the first officer walked me back to the house along with another one who arrived at the same time as the coroner. Though I showed the first cop via the app on my phone when I described the events initially, I now showed them the video on a larger screen. The camera caught footage of the truck as it drove by both times, as well as pulling into the parking lot. Though unfortunately not a clear view of the license plate of the man who tossed the bags out of the frame. We watched the footage over and over, pausing frames, and the officers taking notes. Ultimately, they requested this footage as well as a copy of the files from the past week to see if the truck had been in the area before. I've also been saving footage until the road department installs their own cameras this week. Because this is still fresh, I don't know how many more details. I know the body was in pieces, but I don't know the age of the victim, the gender, cause of death, any of that. Information hasn't been released to the public. I don't know if the coroner has even been able to identify the body yet. Police cruiser has been parked at the fire department next door for constant surveillance in case the guy comes back. The guy who dumped the body was likely a local, because how else would he know that he could dump it there? He probably thought it'd get buried and other people's illegal trash accumulated over the holiday weekend, and sanitation crew wouldn't have bothered to investigate. When I think about how this guy lives in my community, it makes me feel physically ill. To think that he had clearly scouted the area for a dump site, and it may not have been the first time that this had happened, that this could happen again. If I hadn't called it in, and if I hadn't been in the backyard at that exact moment, or if I had ignored that gut feeling, the victim would have never been found, may never find potential justice, and the loved ones may never have closure. In fact, there's a possibility that it just might happen again to another poor soul. I hope it's not me. Dear God, please don't let it be me. I think it's time I move again. Third time's a charm, right? Update. Temporary housing acquired. Moving out. Number 5. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have not driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you're just driving through the same 5 miles of desert, again, and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I should take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 p.m., and my husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to use the bathroom. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to use the bathroom, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the other stall. She didn't look quite homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild gray hair, almost shoulder length, if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was wearing ragged-looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. Several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulders crooked like she hadn't even bothered to take more than a few seconds to put it on correctly. She was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this is when I felt the first tinge of something wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body angled a little bit towards me, and her face was looking at the mirror, though. Her body was tensed up, but legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to do something. Her hands were not up by her face or trying to fix her mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows, also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy and slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, and then paused. Fingers only an inch from the lock, and I stayed as silent as I could manage to confirm what I thought I had just heard. Yes. Breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave, and at this point I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she left, only to stick around to be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave, but this time I waited a few minutes to make sure she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was, but she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he had left the store and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. The two most common theories that people have had commenting on this story is that she was either a drug addict that wanted to mug me or she was working with a sex trafficking ring.